He threw her wedding ring into the rain like it was a piece of trash. Damon Calderon didn't yell. He didn't even raise his voice. That was somehow worse. He stood on the marble steps of his estate at 2 in the morning, rain soaking his collar, and looked at his wife of 4 years the way a man looks at a parking ticket, annoyed, inconvenienced, already forgetting. "You were useless when I married you," he said. "You'll be useless when you're gone." Elara Veyne didn't flinch. She picked up her one suitcase, walked past him without a word, and disappeared into the dark. What Damon didn't know, what he couldn't have imagined, was that by morning, his entire empire would begin to crack, and the quiet woman he'd just thrown away would be the reason why. If you've ever been dismissed by someone who should have known better, keep watching. Because this story belongs to every person who was ever called nothing by someone who needed them to stay that way. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss a story like this one. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Let's go back to the beginning. Elara had not cried in 4 years. Not at the wedding, which had felt less like a celebration and more like a negotiation she hadn't been invited to finish. Not during the early months when Damon's attention had been brief and conditional, distributed like a bonus, withheld whenever she asked too many questions. Not during the dinners where his associates talked over her head and around her presence as though she were furniture that someone had accidentally given a face. She had sat through all of it with her hands folded in her lap and her expression carefully neutral, and not one tear had made it past her eyelids. She had learned that from her grandfather. Silas Veyne had once told her, when she was 11 years old and furious over something she couldn't even remember now, that the most dangerous thing a person could do in a room full of enemies was show them exactly how much they hurt you. Tears are information, he'd said, not unkindly, but with the particular directness of a man who had survived things he never discussed. And information given freely is power given away. She'd never forgotten it. So when Damon's driver pulled through the gates of the Calderon estate for the last time, and the tires hissed against the wet pavement, and the headlights swept across the empty fountain in the center of the driveway, Elara sat in the back seat with her suitcase between her knees and her hands in her coat pockets, and she did not cry. She thought about what came next. The driver, a man named Portis who had worked for the Calderon household for 11 years and had never once looked directly at her, parked the car and got out without a word. That was Damon's instruction. You didn't ask the staff to hold doors or carry bags for a woman being dismissed. That would have suggested she was worth the effort. Elara opened her own door. She stepped out into the rain. The coat she was wearing was plain black wool, slightly oversized, the kind of coat that read as practical rather than fashionable. Damon had commented on it once, early in the marriage, with a little tilt of his head that managed to be condescending without technically being an insult. "You dress like someone who doesn't want to be noticed," he'd said. She'd thanked him. He hadn't realized she meant it. She stood at the base of the marble steps and looked up at the front door of the house and noticed that it was already closed. The lights in the entry hall were off. Damon hadn't come to see her out. He'd sent Portis and gone back to whatever he'd been doing. Probably the phone call she'd interrupted 3 hours earlier when she'd walked into his office and found him with his voice low and his back turned and a name on his lips that she'd been waiting 8 months to hear him say out loud. She hadn't said anything then either. She'd backed out of the doorway, returned to the bedroom, and began packing. It was Damon who had come to find her. He'd appeared in the doorway of their room with his jacket still on and his phone in his hand, and taken one look at her open suitcase and said, with genuine contempt, "Finally." She'd looked at him. He'd said it again, the thing about being useless. He said it like he'd been holding it for years and had simply decided tonight was convenient. Then he'd called Portis. Elara had finished folding a sweater. She'd zipped the suitcase. She'd picked it up. And before she walked out past him, she'd paused long enough to pull her wedding ring from her finger and set it on the lid of his open laptop. Not thrown, not left on the nightstand. Right on the laptop, where he'd have to move it to use the keyboard. She wanted him to have to pick it up himself. Now she stood in the driveway in the rain and she looked at the dark upper windows of the house and she thought, 22 months. That was how long she'd needed. She had calculated 14, hoped for 18, prepared for 24. 22 was close enough. She pulled out her phone and sent a single text message to a number she'd memorized years before ever meeting Damon Calderon. The message was 4 words. The lock is open. Then she walked to the end of the driveway, set her suitcase down on the curb, and waited. It took 6 hours. She waited in a cafe 2 blocks from the estate, the kind of place that stays open all night for the people who need it to. And she drank bad coffee and read a paperback she'd been carrying in her coat pocket for 3 weeks without opening. The rain thinned out around 4 in the morning. By 5 it had stopped entirely. The sky went from black to a bruised, reluctant gray. At 8 minutes past 7 her phone buzzed once. Airfield, 40 minutes. She left cash on the table, picked up her suitcase, and walked outside to find a car she didn't recognize idling at the curb with its hazards off and its engine barely audible. The driver didn't speak, neither did she. The airfield was small and coastal, the kind of place that existed on maps but not in casual conversation. A strip of cracked tarmac cut into a headland overlooking the water, used by charter services and the occasional private owner who valued access over convenience. When they pulled through the gate, 3 black vehicles were already parked at the edge of the tarmac in a tight diagonal line, and a 4th was pulling in behind them. The jet was already there. It was not large and it was not showy. It was the kind of aircraft that said serious money precisely by refusing to perform. Matte black, no visible markings, the stairs already folded down. And standing at the base of those stairs was a man named Cass Fariel, who had worked for the Veyne family for 31 years and had the posture of someone who had never once in that time been surprised. He was in his 50s, dark-eyed, gray at the temples, wearing a coat that was better than it looked. He had known Elara since she was 7 years old. When she stepped out of the car, he removed his hat. "Mrs. Veyne," he said. He used her maiden name. He always had. "Your grandfather ordered us to bring you home." Elara looked at him for a moment. "Silas sent you?" she said. Something crossed Cass's face that she recognized but couldn't quite name. He was choosing words. "He gave the order," Cass said carefully, "before he passed." The morning air was cold off the water and tasted of salt and diesel, and she stood very still and let that land. Her grandfather was dead. She said, "When?" 11 days ago. He asked that you not be told until you were clear." 11 days. She'd been inside that house sitting across from Damon at dinner, watching his associates move money through channels she'd spent months learning to read, all of it while Silas Veyne, the only person who had ever fully understood what she was doing and why, had already been gone. Her chest did something complicated and she pressed it back down. "Is there a situation?" she said. "Yes," Cass said. "There's a situation." They boarded. The flight took less than 2 hours. She spent most of it looking out the window at the Atlantic and thinking about the last conversation she'd had with her grandfather, 3 months ago, over the phone, brief by necessity, both of them careful about what they said on any line that traveled through a switch. He'd asked her how close she was. She'd told him within the year. He'd said, "Don't let them make you into something you're not before you get out." She'd told him she wouldn't. She hadn't told him she loved him. She hadn't because he would have known it meant she was worried about him, and she hadn't wanted to give him that. She stared at the ocean and let herself have 30 seconds of something raw and private, and then she put it away. When the jet began its descent, she could see the estate from the air. The Veyne property sat on a headland above the Atlantic coast, a vast arrangement of stone buildings connected by covered walkways and terraced grounds that fell in stages toward the cliff edge. It was not beautiful in the way that things built for beauty are beautiful. It was imposing in the way that things built to last are imposing. Thick walls, deep windows, built into the rock as though the building had always been there, and the cliff had simply grown up around it. Elara had grown up inside those walls. She had not been back in 4 years. The cars met them at the private landing strip at the base of the property. Cass rode with her up the switchback road to the main entrance, and he spent most of the drive looking straight ahead and giving her information in the flat, efficient way he'd always delivered difficult things. Silas had died in his sleep. No indication of foul play, though the family doctor had been asked to confirm twice. The will had been read privately to an audience of lawyers and exactly 2 family members, neither of whom had been Elara's father or her cousins. The financial instruments attached to the estate had been restructured in the 14 months prior to Silas's death, quietly and through channels that were not obvious, and the result was that effective control of the Veyne organization's international financial network had passed, in its entirety, to one person. He left it to me, Elara said. It wasn't a question. He left it to you, Cass confirmed. My father is aware. And Cass glanced at the window. He's managed his response well so far, which meant he was furious in hiding it, which was at least better than the alternative. Her father, Elara Veyne, was a man of calculated competencies who had spent 25 years managing the organization's American operations with a kind of blunt effectiveness that Silas had always respected while privately finding limited. Roland was good at what he was good at. He was not good at what Elara was good at. And Silas had apparently decided, sometime in the past 14 months, to make that distinction permanent. The car stopped. She got out and looked at the front of the house and felt the weight of everything it contained pressing outward through the stone. 4 years of absence, a war she'd spent years engineering, a man she hadn't spoken to in 11 days who had nonetheless been her anchor for all of it. She picked up her suitcase. The doors opened from the inside. Her father was standing in the hall. Elara Veyne was 61 years old and still carried himself like a man who expected to fill a room simply by entering it. He was tall, gray-haired, dressed as though he'd been awake for hours in a jacket that didn't look slept in. His face, when he saw her, did several things in rapid succession: surprise, relief, calculation, and then something older and harder that she had never been able to fully read. "You're here," he said. "I'm here," she said. He didn't move toward her and she didn't move toward him, and they stood 6 feet apart in the entry hall of the house they'd both grown up in, and the air between them was dense with things neither of them was going to say first. "The will," she said. "We should talk about that privately." "We will. But I want to know right now whether you're going to make this difficult." Roland looked at her for a long moment. He had her same stillness, or she had his. She'd never been sure which direction it ran. "Your grandfather made his decision," he said finally. "I'm not here to contest it." That was more than she'd expected and less than she'd hoped for. "Good," she said. She walked past him. There was a room on the 3rd floor that Silas had always used as a secondary office. Not the formal one with the big desk and the window facing the road, but a smaller room at the back of the east wing that overlooked the cliff and the water below. She went there first, before anything else. She sat down in his chair. The desk was clean. Someone had gone through it already, carefully, but not carefully enough. She could tell by the way the papers were stacked that they'd been lifted and replaced rather than simply rearranged. It didn't matter. Anything that had actually mattered wouldn't have been on top of a desk. She sat there for a while, in his chair, looking out at the Atlantic. Then she opened the bottom left drawer, the one with the small gouge in the wood from when she was 9 and had tried to use it as a step stool, and she reached to the back of it and found what she already knew was there: a small envelope. Her name, in his handwriting. She held it for a moment before opening it. Inside was a single index card with 4 lines written on it in ink. "You already know most of it. The part you don't is closer than you think. Look at who benefits from both families losing, not who has the most to gain from us, who has the most to gain from us and them both falling at once. You were right about the marriage. I should have told you earlier that I knew. I'm sorry I didn't. Finish it." She read it twice. Then she set it face down on the desk and looked out the window. Who has the most to gain from both families falling at once? She thought about the name she'd heard Damon say on the phone 3 nights ago. The one she'd backed out of his office to avoid reacting to, Lucian Vale. She'd first encountered that name 8 months ago, buried in a financial transfer that shouldn't have existed. A routing thread connecting a Calderon subsidiary to a shell holding in the Caymans that traced back, through 4 layers of corporate insulation, to an entity that the Veyne family's external advisors had been using since the late 90s. Not a name at first, just a shape, a pattern in the numbers that suggested someone who knew both organizations from the inside. She'd spent the next 3 months pulling on that thread while sitting across the dinner table from Damon, while attending his associate's functions with her hands folded in her lap and her expression pleasant, while being dismissed and overlooked and described as useless. She'd found the name 6 weeks ago. Lucian Vale, Damon's most trusted advisor. The man who had, according to everything she'd uncovered, also been the one who had originally arranged the introduction between Damon Calderon and Elara Veyne's daughter 4 years ago. The man who had built the marriage that Damon had just thrown away. And now, sitting in her dead grandfather's chair with an index card in her hands that confirmed what she'd already suspected, She understood something she hadn't before. Not completely. Lucien didn't want the Calderons to win. He didn't want the Veynes to win either. He wanted both families in a war neither could survive, and he wanted to be standing in the wreckage when it was over. The ocean was flat and gray below the cliff, and she looked at it for a long time. She was not yet certain about everything. She was missing at least one piece, something concrete, something that would hold in a room full of people with lawyers and money and the willingness to use both. Damon had something. She didn't know what exactly, but the pattern in the financial records suggested he was sitting on information he didn't know the full value of. Something Lucien had used to control him that had left a record Lucien hadn't fully cleaned. She was going to need that, which meant, at some point, she was going to need Damon. She almost laughed at that. The man who had stood on his own front steps at 2 a.m. and told her she was worthless. She was going to need him, not to be saved by him, not to be forgiven by him. She needed the piece he was carrying without knowing he carried it, and she needed to get it before Lucien realized the board had shifted. She put the index card back in the envelope and the envelope in her coat pocket. She stood up from her grandfather's chair. She had work to do. And somewhere across the city, in a house that was already beginning to come apart in ways its owner didn't yet understand, Damon Calderon was picking up his phone and seeing the first of several calls he wasn't going to know how to answer. The silence he'd expected after letting her go was not coming. Something else was. Damon found out about the money on a Tuesday. Not from his accountant. Not from the team of financial analysts he kept on retainer at a firm in Midtown, whose entire job was to watch his numbers breathe. He found out because his housekeeper, a woman named Greta, who had worked for him for 9 years and who he had never once thought to distrust, knocked on the door of his home office at 7:40 in the morning and handed him a printed bank statement with an expression on her face like she'd found something dead in the garden. "This came through the fax machine," she said. He hadn't used the fax machine in 3 years. He took the paper from her and looked at it, and the first thing he felt was not alarm. It was the particular irritation of a man who believes an error has been made by someone beneath his attention. He'd correct it. He'd make a call. He'd have it resolved by lunch. Then he read the numbers again. 11 transfers. Combined total, 4,300,000 and change. All authorized in a 48-hour window beginning the night before last. All bearing his digital signature, the encrypted key that only existed on his personal device and in a backup server that only 2 people in the world had access to. He was one of them. He set the paper down on the desk and picked up his phone and called Marcus Teal, his head of financial operations, a man so cautious with money that he kept 3 separate audit logs for every transaction over $10,000. Marcus picked up on the second ring and said, before Damon could speak, "I know. I've been trying to reach you since 6. "What happened?" Damon said. "I don't know yet. The signatures are clean. They'll pass verification. Whoever did this had full access." "Who authorized the disbursements on the receiving end?" A pause. Too long. "Marcus?" "The receiving accounts are shells. 4 of them in the Caymans, 2 in Luxembourg. They've already been emptied and closed. Whoever was on the other end knew to move fast." Damon put the phone down without hanging up and sat in his chair and looked at the fax paper for a long time. 4 million wasn't catastrophic. Not for him. But that wasn't the point, and he knew it. The point was the signature. The point was that someone had reached into the locked room of his financial infrastructure and used his own hand to move money he hadn't touched, and they'd done it cleanly enough that it had taken a fax from an anonymous source to bring it to his attention. Someone wanted him to know. Not because they'd made a mistake, because they wanted him scared. He picked the phone back up. "Get Lucien in here." "He's not answering his cell," Marcus said. "Then send someone to his apartment." "I did," Marcus said. 45 minutes ago." Another pause. "He's not there, Damon. His housekeeper said he left last night with luggage." The room felt different after that. The air in it felt different. Damon sat very still and thought about the last time he'd seen Lucien Vale, 2 evenings ago, in this same office, going over the quarterly projections with the particular ease of a man who had been in this room 1,000 times and felt no obligation to perform comfort because he genuinely had it. Lucien had poured himself the drink. He'd asked, almost as an aside, whether Elara had left cleanly. Damon had said yes. No scene. No lawyers contacted. She'd simply gone. Lucien had nodded. "Good," he'd said. Cleaner this way. Damon had thought that was an odd word. Cleaner. He'd let it pass. He didn't let it pass now. He stood up and walked to the window and looked out at the driveway where, 48 hours earlier, Greta had watched from the upstairs hall as Portis drove his wife away in the dark. The driveway was empty now. The fountain was off for the season. The ring he'd found on his laptop keyboard. He'd left it on the desk, hadn't known what to do with it, hadn't let himself think too hard about that moment because thinking about it produced an uncomfortable pressure in his chest that felt embarrassingly close to something he didn't intend to name. He thought about it now. She'd placed it on the keyboard, not the nightstand, not the floor, not thrown at him, which would have been in character for most women he'd known in similar situations. And yes, he was aware that the situations had occurred before, which was a thing he categorized as irrelevant and which was probably not irrelevant. She'd put the ring exactly where he would have to move it to do work. Deliberate. Controlled. Like everything else she'd ever done in this house that he'd spent 4 years interpreting as passivity. He thought, what if it wasn't passivity? He picked up the phone again and called a different number. A man named Dressler, who ran security for the Calderon organization and who had, 18 months ago, quietly expressed a concern about Elara that Damon had dismissed at the time. Dressler picked up on the first ring. "I need everything you have on my wife," Damon said. A silence, then, "Ex-wife." "Don't." "I'm going to need a bigger mandate than that," Dressler said. "Last time I brought something to you about her, you told me to let it go." "I know what I said. So this is different now." "Yes," Damon said. "This is different now." Dressler took a breath. "Give me 6 hours." 4. He hung up. He didn't move from the window for a while. The pressure in his chest had settled into something colder and more functional, which was easier to work with. He was not a man who handled uncertainty well in any emotional register, but he was extremely good at converting uncertainty into investigation and investigation into leverage. That was, if he was being honest with himself, one of the primary skills that had built what he had. The question was whether whatever he was about to find was something he could use, or something that would use him. Across the city, on the 3rd floor of a cliffside estate that overlooked a different stretch of the same Atlantic, Elara Veyne was sitting across a long table from her father and 3 men she recognized and one she didn't. The one she didn't was a lawyer. Not the Veyne family's primary counsel, Elara knew all of them by face and most by name. This was someone newer, someone Roland had clearly brought in specifically for this meeting, which told her the meeting was not going to be what it had been described as. It had been described as an orientation, a briefing on the estate's current legal and financial status, following the transition of oversight. What it actually was, she understood within the first 4 minutes, was an attempt to restructure the transition. The lawyer's name was Fenn. He was young for what he was doing, mid-30s, expensive suit, the kind of practiced neutrality in his expression that people developed either by working in law or by growing up in households where emotion was treated as a deficiency. He laid 3 documents on the table in front of Elara with the careful positioning of someone who had rehearsed this moment. "In reviewing the instruments your grandfather established," Fenn said, "our analysis has identified several provisions that may benefit from clarification." "Clarification," Elara said. "The language around operational authority is broad. There are interpretations that—" "Give me the documents," she said. He slid them toward her. She read the first page of each without rushing. She could feel her father watching her from the far end of the table, his posture precisely controlled, his hands flat on the surface in front of him. The other 2 men, cousins by blood, Harlan and Drew, both of whom had spent the last decade believing they were next in line for something, were doing less well at controlling their expressions. Harlan had a habit of pressing his lips together when he was angry. He was pressing them together now, hard enough to lose color. She set the documents down. "These reinterpret the trust structure to require co-authorization," she said. "Specifically my father's co-authorization, for any decision above a threshold that would effectively cover everything that matters." "It's a protective measure," Fenn said. "Given the scale of the assets involved, my grandfather wrote this trust for 4 years," Elara said. "He worked with 3 separate legal teams in 2 countries. He was not a man who left things ambiguous by accident." She looked at her father directly. "This is an insult to him." Roland held her eyes. "This is practicality." "You've had 11 days," she said. He's been gone 11 days and you've already got documents prepared. He's been sick for 8 months, Elara. And you waited until I was in this building. The silence that followed was the kind that didn't need to be filled. Everyone in the room understood what had just been said. The cousins looked at the table. Fen looked at his documents. Roland kept looking at her with that expression she'd never been fully able to read, somewhere between frustration and something more complicated that might have been pride if he'd allowed himself to recognize it. "I'm not signing these," she said. She pushed them back across the table. "I'm going to honor what Silas built. I'm going to need your cooperation to do that effectively, and I'm willing to work with you toward that. But I will not begin by undoing what he decided." She stood. "If you want to contest the will, that's your right. But I'd encourage you to think very carefully about the timing, given what's currently moving in the Calderon situation." That landed. She could see it land on her father's face, a slight shift, a calculation starting behind his eyes. "What's moving?" he said. "Money," she said. "Someone else's money, going somewhere it shouldn't." She picked up the documents and held them out to Fen, who took them with the expression of someone pretending not to have been holding his breath. "I'll need the full financial records for the last 14 months by end of day. Everything Silas was tracking, including the external correspondence." She left the room. In the hallway, she let out a breath that she hadn't fully realized she was holding and leaned against the wall for 3 seconds, just 3, with her eyes closed. Then she straightened up and kept moving. Cass was waiting at the end of the corridor. He fell into step beside her without being asked. "How bad was it?" he said. "About what I expected." She turned a corner. "Get me everything on Lucian Vale that the family has. I know Silas was watching him. I need to know how long and what he found." Cass's expression didn't change, which was itself informative. He'd been watching Vale for approximately 2 years. She stopped walking. "He knew," she said. "He suspected. He didn't have confirmation." "What did he have?" "A record of communications between Vale and an account that traces back to a Veyne family member. Not you, not your father." Cass paused. "Your Uncle Marsh." Marshall Veyne, her father's younger brother. A man who had operated on the periphery of the organization for 20 years with the particular comfort of someone who believed proximity to power was equivalent to possessing it. He'd never been trusted with anything central. He'd always seemed to accept that with more grace than it deserved. Apparently he hadn't accepted it at all. "Marsh and Vale," she said. "How long?" "The earliest communication we have is 6 years ago." 6 years. 2 years before Damon had appeared in her life. 2 years before the introduction that had always felt slightly too clean, too convenient, as though someone had cleared the path in advance. Someone had. She started walking again, faster. "I need a secure line," she said. "I need to make a call I don't want on any system connected to this building." Cass produced a phone from his inside pocket and handed it to her without breaking stride. She dialed a number from memory. Not Damon's number, but close to it. A number that sat 1 degree removed from the Calderon house through a channel she'd established 8 months ago for exactly this contingency. It rang 4 times before a man answered. "Veyne," he said. Not a question. "I need to know if Vale is still in the city," she said. A pause. She could hear paper moving. "Last confirmed location was your husband's estate 2 nights ago. He left somewhere between midnight and 3 a.m. Since then..." More paper. "Nothing confirmed." "He's mobile," she said. "Appears so." "Is there any contact with Marsh Veyne on record in the last 2 weeks?" This pause was longer. She counted it. 12 seconds. "There's a meeting," the man said slowly, as though reading something while he spoke. 11 days ago. Same night your grandfather died." The hallway she was walking through was long and stone-floored, and her footsteps echoed in a way that had always made her think of the building asserting itself, reminding people it had been here longer than any of them. She listened to that echo for a moment. 11 days ago, the night Silas died, Lucian Vale and Marshall Veyne had met. "Location," she said. "Hotel, Midtown, 2 hours." "Who booked the room?" "Vale's assistant, under a corporate account." "I need everything from that meeting. Anything your people picked up, any signal." "It'll take a day." "You have until tonight," she said, and hung up. She handed the phone back to Cass. He pocketed it. Marsh will be at the estate, she said. He's been here since the funeral. He's pretending to grieve. Yes. Has he asked about the will? Twice. Both times to your father. Your father told him nothing. She thought about that. He knows. Or Vale told him enough that he knows the distribution didn't go the way he expected. She stopped outside a door at the end of the corridor. Where is he right now? East Garden, last I heard. I want eyes on him from this point forward. Not obvious. I don't want him to know he's being watched. Of course. She put her hand on the door. And Cass. She didn't turn around. Who in this building knew Silas was ill before the last month? A very brief silence. The kind a careful man produces when he's deciding how much truth is appropriate. Your father, Marsh, the doctor, and me. Did Marsh know how sick? He would have known it was serious. The timeline. Cass stopped. He would have had enough information to plan. She opened the door and went inside. It was a small room, one of the estate's secondary offices, functional rather than formal, with a window that looked out at the rock face and a desk that was empty except for a telephone and a legal pad. She sat down and picked up the pad and a pen and wrote 3 columns across the top of the first page. What I have, what I need, what I can't lose. She filled in the first column for 20 minutes without stopping, her handwriting getting smaller and tighter as she went, the way it always did when she was moving fast through a problem that had too many moving parts. Then she looked at the second column and wrote one name, Damon. Not because she wanted to, not because anything about reaching back toward that man felt comfortable or simple, but because the missing piece of this was somewhere inside his operation, buried in something he was probably sitting on without understanding its full weight. And if Lucien had spent 6 years building toward whatever was coming next, the timeline was closing and she could not afford to wait for something cleaner. She looked at the third column for a long time before she wrote anything. Then she wrote, myself. She put the pen down. In a hotel room on the 43rd floor of a building 40 minutes from the Veyne estate, Lucien Vale was on the phone. He was standing at the window in the way that men who think of themselves as architects of things like to stand, overlooking what they're building, or in this case, what they're about to tear down. He was a composed man, well past 60, with the kind of lean, unhurried physicality of someone who had spent decades moving carefully through rooms where other people moved fast and broke things. His hair was silver, and his suits were quiet, and his voice, on the phone, was the same temperature it always was. She's at the estate, said the person on the other end. I expected that, Lucien said. The meeting with Roland didn't go the way he planned. That I also expected. He looked at the city below him, the grid of it, the way it moved. And Damon. He started looking. He found the transfers. Good. He called Dressler. Also good. A pause on the other end. You're not worried. I'm not, Lucien said. He'll find what I left for him to find, which will point him toward her. And she'll find what I left for her to find, which will point her toward him. 2 people who don't trust each other, with evidence that implicates the other. He turned away from the window. They'll destroy each other before they think to look in the same direction. And Marsh. Lucien's expression did something small and cold. Marsh has served his purpose. He doesn't know that yet. He hung up and set the phone on the dresser and poured himself a glass of water from the carafe on the desk and drank it slowly. He'd been building this for 6 years. He had been, for 6 years, the most trusted person in 2 separate criminal organizations, trusted by Damon, who believed Vale had found him the perfect wife and built him an empire, trusted by the Veyne periphery, through Marsh, who believed Vale was helping him take what should have been his. Neither of them had understood what Vale actually wanted, because what Vale actually wanted was not something either of them was capable of imagining, because it required holding both organizations clearly in your mind simultaneously and understanding exactly how much each was worth at the moment it collapsed. He'd done the math 1,000 times. The Calderon network, folded into the Veyne structure under circumstances of mutual destruction, scooped up by a holding entity that had spent 5 years acquiring the right legal architecture to absorb both. It was worth something that made his chest tight to think about, even now, even having thought about it for years. He wasn't greedy. He had always found greed to be a limited instinct. He was thorough. And the only thing that could interfere with thorough was 2 people who hated each other figuring out they shared a common enemy. He picked up his phone again and sent a text message to a number that would forward through 3 separate relays before arriving anywhere. Accelerate the timeline. Then he put the phone in his pocket and looked at himself briefly in the mirror above the dresser and straightened his collar. Back at the Calderon estate, Damon was on his third call of the afternoon when Dressler walked in carrying a tablet and a look on his face that Damon had never seen there before, which immediately stopped the call. "I need to call you back," Damon said, and hung up. Dressler set the tablet on the desk between them without a word and stepped back. On the screen was a financial document, not one of the ones from this morning. Something older, 2 years old, with routing threads traced in red by whoever had done the analysis, branching outward from a central account like a root system. At the center of the root system was a shell entity. 3 layers deep, through holding structures Damon recognized as legitimate Calderon vehicles, the entity connected to something else. Something he'd never seen before. Something with the Veyne family's legal fingerprints on it, but not recent Veyne, not Roland, not Elara, not any of the operational branches. The identifier at the bottom of the chain was a trustee name, Marshall Veyne. Damon stared at it. He looked up at Dressler. "How long?" "At least 4 years," Dressler said. "Maybe more. This is what I can trace. There could be earlier layers." "And Lucian?" Dressler's jaw moved. "He's the one who routed it. His authorization signature is on the original structure. He set it up and then buried it under the Calderon maintenance accounts, so it would look like routine overhead." 4 years. While Lucian had been in this office drinking Damon's liquor and advising him on decisions that touched every part of his organization, he'd been running a financial bridge between the Calderon house and a Veyne family member that no one was supposed to find. Damon pushed back from the desk and stood up. He walked to the window. He put his hands in his pockets. He stood there breathing in a way that was slower and more deliberate than it should have been, which was the only visible sign that anything inside him was not completely controlled. His most trusted advisor. And a Veyne. He thought about Elara. He thought about the 4 years of dinners and functions and nights in a house that had never quite felt like a shared space. He thought about the ring on the keyboard. He thought about the way she'd looked at him sometimes across a room, not with the blankness he'd interpreted as vacancy, but with something quieter and more specific. The look of someone measuring. He'd dismissed her as useless. He'd been dismissing someone who was watching him. He turned around. "Where is she?" he said. Dressler knew who he meant. "The Veyne estate. She arrived this morning." "Get me a car," Damon said. Dressler blinked. "You want to go to the Veyne estate?" "I want to go to the Veyne estate." "Damon, that's—" "I know what it is," Damon said. He picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. "Get me the car." He was already moving toward the door when his phone buzzed. He looked at it. Unknown number, text message, 3 words. "Don't come alone." He stopped in the doorway. He looked at the message for a long time. Then he texted back, "Who is this?" The response was immediate. "You already know." He stood in the doorway of his own office with his jacket half on and the tablet behind him full of evidence of a betrayal that had been running for 4 years inside the walls of his own house. And he understood, with the particular clarity of a man who has spent a lifetime in rooms where power is the only honest currency, that he had reached the edge of something he had never reached before. He was out of moves he could make alone. And the only person who might have the other half of what he needed had just been thrown out of his house in the rain 48 hours ago. He put the phone in his pocket. "Get the car," he said again, quieter this time. And Dressler, who had worked for Damon Calderon for 11 years and knew better than most what it cost that man to say something quietly, got the car. The car Damon arrived in was not armored. That was the first thing Elara noticed when she saw it come through the gate. A standard black sedan, 1 driver, no follow vehicle, no security presence pulling up behind it. Either he'd come alone because he was too arrogant to think he needed protection at a Veyne property, or he'd come alone because he didn't want anyone to know he was here. She decided it was the second thing. She was standing at the top of the stone steps when the car stopped. She hadn't gone down to meet him. She'd let him come up, which meant he had to climb the steps toward her, which meant for the duration of those 12 steps she was above him and he knew it. She didn't do it to be theatrical. She did it because every inch of this situation required her to be precise about where the weight was sitting. He looked worse than she'd expected. Not broken, Damon Calderon would not permit himself to look broken in front of her or anyone else, but there was a tightness around his eyes and a set to his jaw that she recognized as the specific fatigue of a man who hadn't slept and was trying to perform the kind of stillness that should come from actually sleeping. His jacket was slightly wrong. He'd put it on in a hurry or hadn't looked at himself carefully before he left. He stopped at the top step. They looked at each other. "I got your text," he said. "I assumed you would." "You sent it from an unknown number." "I did." He looked at her for a moment like he was deciding how to hold this conversation, and then apparently deciding that there was no version of it that started comfortably. "You knew about the transfers." "I knew about a version of them," she said. "How much did you find?" 4 years of a financial bridge I didn't know existed. Lucien's signature on the original structure. A Veyne family name on the receiving end. He watched her face. "Marshall." "Yes." "You knew about Marsh, I found it 11 days ago." His jaw tightened. 11 days. "Come inside," she said. "There are things you need to see, and I'm not going to stand on the steps to show them to you." She turned and went through the doors without waiting to see if he followed. He followed. She took him to the glass-walled library on the second floor. It was the room she'd chosen deliberately, not the formal reception rooms her father used for organizational business, not Silas's office, which felt too personal, but a room that was neutral and transparent, where the light came through the windows on 3 sides, and nothing could be concealed in a corner. She needed him to feel that. She needed him to understand that she wasn't performing concealment anymore. She'd had Cass bring the materials up an hour ago, arranged on the long table that ran the center of the room. Not a stack, not a pile, organized in the specific order she intended to walk him through them, which was chronological in the sense that mattered, not date order, but sequence of understanding. She stood at the end of the table. He stopped at the other end and looked at the spread of documents, photographs, printed communications, and 3 USB drives arranged between them, and she watched his face go through several things in fast succession. Recognition, calculation, something that might have been controlled dread in another man, but in him compressed into a slight flattening of expression. "How long have you been building this?" he said. "Since before I married you." The room was quiet. The windows looked out at the Atlantic, which was moving in that heavy, late-morning way that suggested weather coming in from the northeast. "You married me to investigate me," he said. "I married you to investigate what was happening around you. There's a difference." "Not from where I'm standing." "No," she said. "I don't suppose there is." She didn't apologize, and she didn't soften it, and she didn't look away. "I need you to understand something before we go further. I'm not your enemy. I was never investigating you specifically. I was investigating a pattern in the financial connections between your organization and mine that suggested someone was positioning both families to fail simultaneously. You were the access point, that's all." He looked at her for a long time. "That's all." "Sit down, Damon." He didn't sit down, but he moved to the side of the table and looked at the first document she'd arranged, which was a financial routing map she'd constructed over 8 months. A visual representation of the shell structure Lucien had built, rendered in the kind of clean diagrammatic form that her grandfather's legal team used for regulatory submissions. She walked him through it. She did not speak quickly, and she did not editorialize. She pointed to each node in the structure and explained what it was, who controlled it, and what flowed through it. She told him where she'd found each piece and what it had taken to trace it. She did not tell him how many nights she'd sat in the corner bedroom of his house with her laptop and a cup of cold coffee, reconstructing this architecture while he slept 12 feet away. He was a smart man. She'd always known that, even when she'd wished it wasn't true, because his intelligence had made her work harder, and his blindness toward her had been both the greatest tactical advantage she had, and the thing that had, somewhere in the second year, started to leave a particular kind of bruise she hadn't expected. She watched understanding move through him as she spoke. It moved the way understanding moves through men who are used to being the most informed person in a room. First resistance, then the forced reassessment, then the cold settling of a new picture forming in a place where the old one used to be. When she finished, he said nothing for almost a minute. Then he said, "Vale set up the marriage." "Yes." "He introduced me to your father's people. He arranged the introduction. 3 months before you ever met me, Lucien had lunch with a man named Jero, who ran external relations for my father's network. That lunch was the first step. Jero thought he was facilitating a business introduction. He didn't know he was being used as a connector. And you were already investigating by then. I'd been watching the pattern for 6 months when Lucian's approach came. When my grandfather told me about the introduction, I asked him to let me go in. He didn't like it. We argued about it for 2 weeks. She paused. He eventually agreed because he understood what I was seeing and he didn't have anyone else positioned to see it from the inside. Damon picked up one of the documents from the table. He held it without looking at it. You could have told me. When? She said. Not challenging, genuinely asking. At the beginning, you would have dismissed it, or you would have confronted Lucian before I had enough. In the middle, you would have used it to leverage your own position before the picture was complete. I needed time. You had 4 years. I needed 22 months. The other 26 were spent waiting for one piece I couldn't manufacture. He put the document down. He looked at her. What piece? She reached to the end of the table and picked up a folder she'd kept separate from the rest. She set it in front of him. He opened it. Inside were 3 printed communications, email chains, headers partially visible, the kind of forensic printout that came from a technical extraction rather than a forwarded message. The sender name on all 3 was a corporate alias that appeared in the routing map on the table as one of Lucien's mid-tier shells. The recipient was not Marsh Veyne. The recipient was a name that made Damon go very still. It was a name that belonged to a man who ran the regulatory liaison office for the largest independent crime family oversight body on the eastern seaboard. A man who was, in theory, in the business of ensuring that the major families operated within the unspoken agreements that kept open conflict off the streets. His name was Carver Men. And the emails detailed an arrangement in which Lucian had been feeding him precise, timed information about both the Calderon and Veyne organizations. Enough information to trigger a regulatory intervention at the exact moment of maximum instability. Not to stop the families, to justify the seizure of their combined assets under an emergency authority provision that had been sitting in Men's office for 3 years, never invoked. Damon read all 3. He read them twice. When he looked up, there was something in his face that Elara had never seen there before. Not anger. Anger she'd seen plenty. This was something beneath anger, something that had had the floor taken out from under it. He was going to hand us both to Men, Damon said, after we'd destroyed each other enough that neither organization could fight the seizure. And Men gets a percentage of the absorbed assets through a holding structure that is already in place and has been for 18 months. She let that land. This is the piece I was missing. This is what I needed from your side. Damon closed the folder. He put both hands flat on the table and looked at the surface between them. His breathing was controlled, but she could see it was controlled, which was different from it being natural. Where did you find this? He said. From your system, she said. Specifically from a server your IT team decommissioned 8 months ago that was supposed to be wiped, but wasn't, because the technician who did the wipe used a corrupted protocol and left a recoverable image. Lucien's correspondence from that machine survived. He looked at her. You hacked my system. A system your own team failed to properly secure, yes. He almost laughed. It wasn't a pleasant sound. Of course you did. The almost laugh faded fast. He straightened up. This isn't complete, he said. I know. The emails prove Lucian was talking to Men. They don't prove the seizure mechanism is active. Men can deny the arrangement. The holding structure needs to be traced to him directly, or it's usable as evidence but not as a weapon. I know, she said again. You need more. We need more, she said, which is why I sent you the text. He looked at her steadily. She looked back. The Atlantic through the glass was going darker at the horizon where the weather was building, and the light in the room had shifted from clear to the particular gray gold that preceded a significant change in what the air was doing. He said, What do you need from me? She told him. It took 40 minutes. When she finished, he sat down, finally, belatedly, in the chair across from her, and leaned forward with his elbows on the table and his hands clasped in front of him, and he looked at the arrangement of documents between them, like a man making an assessment of a position he hadn't chosen to be in. If Lucian finds out we're talking, he said, he'll accelerate. He's already accelerating. The transfers this morning weren't random. He's moving the board. I know. So we have 72 hours, she said. Maybe less. He's called a summit. I found out an hour before you arrived. He's convened the major family heads for a private meeting in 4 days. That's his window. Damon went quiet. She watched him absorb it. He'll present at the summit, Damon said, with us in conflict. Both families destabilized. He'll walk in with evidence of our mutual corruption, activate men's mechanism through back channels. And by the time anyone understands what's happened, it's done, she said. The families are dissolved, the assets are absorbed, and Lucian Vale is the only person standing with clean hands and a legal structure already in place to receive everything. He put his hands over his face briefly, just 2 seconds, just a pressure of palms against his eyes, and then dropped them. You said 72 hours, he said. Yes. And you have a plan. I have half of one, she said. You have the other half, you just don't know it yet. He looked at her. She slid a single page across the table. Not from the pile, but from her jacket pocket, folded once. He opened it. It was a name and an address. That's Men's private accountant, she said. Not his official one. The one he uses for things that don't appear in his disclosed financials. I've had a location on him for 3 weeks, but I have no way to approach him without it tracing back to the Veyne organization and giving Lucian exactly the evidence of coordination he needs to trigger the seizure early. She held Damon's eyes. You, however, have a relationship with a man in Men's outer circle who can put someone in a room with that accountant unofficially. No paper, no trace. Damon's mouth tightened. Holt? Yes. You know about Holt. I know about everyone who can get into rooms I can't, she said. That's how I've survived the last 4 years. He looked at the paper. Then he looked at her. The expression on his face was doing something complicated that she didn't try to fully decode. It wasn't trust, not yet, maybe not ever exactly, but it was something adjacent to the recognition of a person whose capabilities you have been catastrophically wrong about. He folded the paper and put it in his jacket pocket. I'll contact Holt tonight, he said. I need the approach made before tomorrow evening. I understood you, he said, with a slight edge that was probably the closest he was going to come to telling her to stop managing him, which she noted and dialed back. He stood. She stood. They were on opposite sides of the table in a room made of glass and gray light, and 4 years of something. Neither of them was going to try to name with the summit 4 days away, and a man who'd spent 6 years building a machine designed to erase them both now actively running it at speed. When this is over, Damon said. She waited. He didn't finish it. He seemed to realize mid-sentence that he didn't know what came after when this is over, or that whatever came after it wasn't something that fit in this room right now. 72 hours, he said instead. Starting now, she said. He left. She stood at the glass and watched the car go back down through the gate, and then she turned around and looked at the table full of evidence and felt the particular weight of what she hadn't told him, because she hadn't told him everything. There was one more piece. Not the accountant, not men, not the seizure mechanism or the holding structure or the summit timeline. Something worse. Something she'd found in the hours between Cass handing her the phone in the corridor and Damon's car coming through the gate, buried in the signals intelligence that her contact had pulled from the hotel meeting between Lucian and Marsh 11 days ago. The intelligence was fragmented, partial audio, the kind of thing that came from a device that had been in the room but not optimally positioned, and so there were gaps, and the gaps were significant. But what was audible was clear enough. Lucian and Marsh had not been meeting to plan. They'd been meeting to confirm, and the thing being confirmed was not the financial seizure. It was something inside the Veyne organization itself. A specific person, a specific role, a specific access point that Lucian needed in order to ensure the evidence Elara had compiled over 4 years would be unverifiable at the critical moment. The access point was the estate's internal records archive. The person with access to that archive, aside from Elara herself, was Cass Farrell, who had worked for the Veyne family for 31 years, who had known Silas was ill for 8 months, who had been the one to hand her an untraceable phone in the corridor. She stood at the glass window and looked at the ocean going dark under the incoming weather, and understood that the man she'd trusted most completely in the 8 months of this operation, the man who had been her operational anchor in this building, who had positioned himself as the loyal extension of her dead grandfather's intentions, had potentially been feeding information to Lucian Vale for longer than she wanted to calculate. She thought about the hotel meeting. 11 days ago, the night Silas died. Who had told Lucian the timing? Who had known the exact window in which Silas would die, and Elara would be unreachable, and the will would be in motion, and the organization would be at its most exposed. She pressed one hand against the cold glass. Outside, the first real rain of the storm began to hit the windows. She needed to know for certain before she moved on it. She couldn't act on fragments. If she was wrong about Cass, she'd lose the one operational resource she had inside this building. At the moment, she could least afford to lose anything. If she was right about him and she didn't act, everything she'd just arranged with Damon, every piece of it, was already on its way to Lucian's phone. She had no way to verify quickly. She had no safe channel that Cass hadn't had a hand in establishing. She was standing in a building full of people she could no longer fully map. Her father, who wanted her authority restructured. Her cousins, who'd been passed over. An uncle who'd been feeding information to the man trying to destroy them all. And now possibly the one person she'd believed was simply, cleanly, on her side. Her grandfather's note was still in her coat pocket. Look at who benefits from both families losing. She'd read that as pointing outward. Toward Lucian. Toward the seizure. But Silas had been careful his whole life. He had never written one thing when he meant only one thing. Look at who benefits from both families losing, not just Lucian. Who else? Who else in this building would benefit from the Veyne organization passing through a moment of maximum chaos? Who had had 31 years to position himself as indispensable, trustworthy, the institutional memory of a family that was about to need institutional memory more than anything else. The rain was hitting the glass in sheets now, and the room had gone dim, and she stood in it without moving and understood that she had just walked Damon Calderon through every piece of her case in a room that Cass Farrell had prepared an hour before his arrival. And if Cass was what she now suspected he might be, then Lucian Vale had just been handed the entire architecture of her operation in the time it had taken her to lay it out on that table. She was not a person who panicked, but she felt, in that moment, something she had not felt in 4 years of sitting across from Damon at dinner while quietly dismantling his advisor's financial infrastructure. Something she had not felt when her grandfather died, or when her father slid those restructuring documents across the table, or when she'd found Marcia's name in the routing threads. She felt the ground move, and in the same instant, her phone buzzed on the table. Not the phone Cass had given her, her own phone. The one with the number only 3 people in the world had. The message was from Damon. It said, "Don't trust whoever set up that room." She stared at it. Then, I noticed the audio device behind the third window panel on the left side. Small. Recent installation. Someone was recording that conversation. She looked at the window. She crossed the room in 6 steps and ran her fingers along the edge of the third panel from the left and found it. A disc the size of a shirt button, adhered to the back edge of the frame where the light didn't reach, with a transmitter barely large enough to see. She pulled it free. She stood holding it in her palm and looked at it and felt the specific quality of silence that follows the moment when the thing you feared most turns out to be exactly as bad as you feared. Cass had set up this room. Cass had arranged these materials on this table. Cass had positioned her across from Damon Calderon in a glass-walled room, and everything she'd said, every piece she'd revealed, every element of the plan she'd laid out over 40 minutes had gone somewhere she hadn't controlled. She put the device in her pocket. She looked at the door. On the other side of that door was a building full of people who were watching her navigate this, and at least one of them was not watching in the way she'd believed, and she could not yet know how far it went or how long it had been running. And she had 72 hours to a summit that would dissolve everything she'd spent 4 years building if she walked into it without a complete picture, and the complete picture had just developed a hole she hadn't known was there. She typed back to Damon, "Come back." 3 seconds. His reply, already turning around. She put the phone in her pocket and straightened her coat and looked at the door again, and she understood that the woman who walked out of this room in the next 30 seconds was going to have to be different from the woman who had walked into it. Not harder exactly, not colder, but stripped of the last assumption of safety that she'd been operating with, which was the assumption that the people surrounding her had been placed there by someone who loved her. Silas was gone. And the man he'd trusted for 31 years was not what he'd seemed. She walked to the door and opened it, and stepped into the corridor and looked directly at Cass Farrell, who was standing at the far end with his hands clasped behind his back, and his expression as composed and unreadable as it had been every day for the past 31 years. She looked at him, He looked at her, and something passed between them that had nothing to do with words. A specific, mutual recognition, the kind that only happens between two people who have been operating in the same space with fundamentally different intentions and have just, simultaneously, understood that the other person knows. She said very quietly, "Don't leave the building." His expression didn't change, but his hands behind his back tightened. Cass didn't move. That was the thing Elara kept coming back to in the 30 seconds that followed. He didn't move, didn't deflect, didn't produce the particular kind of smooth denial that a man who had spent 31 years being trusted would have ready if he'd been maintaining an innocent position. He just stood at the end of the corridor with his hands still clasped behind his back and looked at her with an expression that had finally, after all the years of careful composure, settled into something she could read. Not guilt exactly, older than guilt. The specific exhaustion of a man who has been carrying something heavy for a very long time and has just been told he can put it down, except putting it down means everything changes. "I said don't leave the building," she repeated. "I heard you," he said. "Are you going to?" A pause. The rain on the roof was loud now, a sustained percussion that filled the silence between them with something that was almost white noise. "No," he said. "Good." She didn't take her eyes off him. "Go to the East Study and wait. Don't use any phone, don't contact anyone. If someone tries to contact you, you tell me immediately." "Elara, don't." Her voice was flat. Not loud, flat. The way a surface is flat when everything soft has been pressed out of it. "Not right now. Go." He went. She watched him walk down the corridor until he turned the corner, and then she stood in the empty hallway and pressed the heel of her hand against her sternum and breathed through it. 3 breaths, measured, the kind her grandfather had taught her for moments when the body wanted to run ahead of the mind. Then she pulled out her phone and called Damon. He picked up before the second ring. "How far out are you?" she said. 8 minutes. "Come to the east entrance, not the front. There's a service road that runs along the cliffside. Tell your driver to take the private gate. I'll have it open." "Who knows I'm coming back?" "Assume everyone," she said. "Move fast." She hung up and walked. The estate had 3 internal security stations, a relic of Silas's operational paranoia, which had been one of his most useful qualities. The one she needed was on the ground floor of the East Wing, staffed by a man named Rourke, who had worked property security for 6 years and who, crucially, had been hired after Cass's primary sphere of influence over staffing had been reorganized. She didn't know if that made Rourke clean, but it made him less likely to be compromised through the same channel. She pushed open the security station door without knocking. Rourke was a thick, quiet man in his 40s who looked up from a monitor with the particular alertness of someone whose job required him to be ready to move at any second. He registered her expression and straightened. "Open the East Cliff Gate," she said. "Right now. Expecting 1 vehicle, 2 minutes." He moved without asking why, which was exactly what she needed. "I also need you to lock down internal communications on the estate network for the next 4 hours," she said. "All outgoing signals, phone, data, everything, routed through the security station for manual review before transmission." He turned from the gate panel and looked at her. "That's a full communications hold. I need authorization at the estate director level." "I'm the estate director," she said. "As of 11 days ago, I need that authorization confirmed in the system. Use my access code." She gave him the 6-digit sequence Cass had provided her with on arrival. Rourke typed it in. The system accepted it. She watched the confirmation light go green and felt something loosen slightly in her chest. Not relief exactly, but the specific steadying that came from having closed one opening before the wind came through it. If Cass had been transmitting, he'd just been cut off. If anyone else in the building was operating as a relay, they'd just lost their channel. It wasn't a solution. It was a door closing. Damon's car came through the east gate 4 minutes later. He got out before it fully stopped. Not dramatically, just efficiently, with the particular economy of movement of a man who had made a decision and was now executing it. He was moving differently than he had an hour ago. The tightness around his eyes was still there, but the quality of it had changed. Less fatigue, more focus. He had his jacket properly on this time. She met him at the entrance and didn't waste time. "Walk with me," she said. They moved through the East Wing corridor, which was stone-floored and narrower than the main passages, lit by fixed wall lamps that cast a steady amber light. No one else was in this section at this hour. The device, he said. How recent was the installation? Recent enough that it wasn't in the room when I arrived this morning. Cass had access to the room between my arrival and the meeting. So he knew I was coming. He set up the room, she said. I told him to. I didn't know to tell him not to. Damon was quiet for a step. What's your read on how long? Minimum 2 years based on what I can trace. Possibly the full 6, as long as Lucian has been running this. Your grandfather trusted him. My grandfather trusted what he saw, and what he saw was 31 years of competent loyalty. She stopped at a corner and checked the hallway before turning into it. Silas was sick for 8 months. In the last 4 of those months, he would have been not compromised, but slower to see what was in front of him. That's when it would have been easiest to consolidate a position inside the organization without Silas catching the shape of it. Cass would have known the illness timeline. He was one of 4 people who knew, Damon said very quietly, and the night Silas died. Lucian met with Marsh. Cass knew Silas's condition that day. Someone told Lucian the window was open. She kept walking. I can't prove it was Cass on that specific point. Not yet. But the audio device is enough to take him off the board operationally. What does he give Lucian that Marsh doesn't? Access to the archive, she said. The estate's historical records. 31 years of financial documentation, correspondence, organizational maps. Everything Silas kept. If Lucian gets access to that archive before the summit, he doesn't just have the Veyne organization's current exposure, he has the institutional history, every deal ever made, every agreement, every liability. Dame stopped walking. She turned to face him. The archive is the mechanism, he said. It wasn't a question. Who was working it out, and she let him. Not the seizure authority on its own. Men can invoke the provision, but a seizure of this scale requires documented justification. Evidence of specific violations. Without the archive, he's working from current intelligence only, which is traceable back to Lucian and therefore contestable. He looked at her. With the archive, he has 40 years of documentation that can be selectively presented to justify anything, she finished. And with Cass as his access point, he doesn't need to breach the estate's security. He just needs Cass to walk out with copies. Does Cass still have archive access? I pulled his credentials 40 minutes ago before you arrived, but if he already copied anything, did he? She held his eyes. I don't know. The corridor was very quiet. I need to talk to him, she said, not to confront him, to find out what he's already moved and whether it's reversible. She watched Damon's face. I need you in the room when I do it. Why? Because he spent 31 years managing the Veyne family's internal dynamics. He knows every pressure point, every relationship. If it's just me, he'll manage me. He'll give me enough to look cooperative while protecting what actually matters to him. But you're an unknown to him. He doesn't have a read on how you operate under pressure. She paused. And he doesn't know yet that you found the device. Damon looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded once. They went to the east study. Cass was where she'd told him to be, seated in a chair near the window, the room's single lamp lit against the gray afternoon. He hadn't helped himself to the water on the side table. He hadn't moved the chair. I was sitting with the particular stillness of a man who had been in difficult rooms before and knew that the quality of your stillness was information. He looked at Damon when they entered and something moved across his face. Not surprise, but a rapid recalibration. He hadn't known Damon was back. That was something. Elara sat down across from him. Damon remained standing, slightly to her right, which put Cass in a position where he couldn't look at both of them simultaneously without turning his head. She set the audio device on the table between them. Cass looked at it. How long? She said. He looked at the device for a moment longer. Then he looked at her, and the composure he'd carried for 31 years was still present, but it had changed character. It was no longer the composure of loyalty. She could see that now. It was the composure of a man who had made a calculation and was now reassessing whether the calculation still held. 3 years, he said. The number hit her somewhere she didn't show. What did you give him? Operational schedules, meeting summaries, nothing from the archive. Why nothing from the archive? Because that was my leverage, Cass said. As long as I hadn't given him the archive, I had something he needed, which meant he needed me functional and in position. He looked at the device. If I'd given him the archive, I was expendable. Damon said, from where he was standing, "So you were protecting yourself?" Cass looked at him. "I was surviving. Inside a family that trusted you." The old man's jaw tightened. The family was already compromised. Marsh had been feeding Vale information for 6 years. Your people had a financial bridge running through Veyne shells for 4. This organization had a hole in it before I made any decision. I just chose which side of the hole to stand on. Elara said, "Did you tell him I was investigating?" A pause. The rain had lightened slightly, and in the quiet she could hear the faint rhythm of her own pulse in her ears. "Not specifically," Cass said. "He knew there was someone inside the Calderon household running a parallel investigation. He didn't know it was you until—" He stopped. "Until when?" "Until you left," Cass said. "When Damon put you out. Vale called me that morning." His eyes went briefly to Damon with something that wasn't quite contempt but was in the neighborhood. He said the variable had been removed. I told him the variable had gone home. Damon said nothing. "He knew I was a Veyne," Elara said. "He knew you were Silas's granddaughter from the beginning," Cass said. "The marriage was his design. He knew exactly what he was putting into the Calderon house." The room went very still. Elara had known that intellectually. She'd traced the introduction, she'd followed the thread back to Lucian's hand in the arrangement. But hearing it confirmed this bluntly, in this voice, in this room, produced a sensation that was less like discovery and more like a physical impact. She kept her face even. "He expected me to find something," she said. "He expected you to find what he left for you to find," Cass said. "The Marsh connection, the shell accounts. He wanted you to spend your time inside the Calderon house following a trail that led to a Veyne family traitor, which would position you as a Veyne operative working against Calderon interests. If it ever surfaced, if you were ever exposed inside that house, the story was already written." "I was the proof of Veyne aggression," she said. "Yes." Damon took 2 steps forward. "And you let her walk into that." "I didn't know how much she knew," Cass said. And for the first time there was something raw under the words, something that cost him. "When Silas told me she was going in, I thought she'd find what Vale wanted her to find and come out with a partial picture, and we'd manage it from here. I didn't know she'd been building independently for 6 months before she went in. I didn't know how deep she'd gotten." "When did you know?" Elara said. 8 months ago," he said. "When you started pulling the routing threads that went past the Marsh layer. I saw it in the archive access logs. You were using Silas's old research accounts. You'd gotten past what Vale had planted. You were finding the real structure. And you told Vale." His hands tightened in his lap. "I told him you were close." She looked at him. "I told him you were close," he said again, "and then I stopped telling him things. For 8 months. I gave him nothing." "Why?" He met her eyes. "Because you were right. And I'd spent 3 years telling myself the position I'd taken was rational and survivable. And then I watched you sitting in that house for 4 years by yourself pulling apart something that should have taken a full team, and I—" He stopped. His voice had gone rough at the edges. "I knew Silas for 31 years. What you were doing in there, he would have been proud of it." The room was quiet for a long time. Then Damon said, "He's been operating blind for 8 months. Vale. He thinks Cass is still feeding him." Elara looked at Damon. "He doesn't know what you actually have," Damon said slowly. "He knows you found the Marsh layer. He knows you left. He knows you came here. But if his information pipeline from this building has been empty for 8 months, he's been working from assumptions," she said. "And some of those assumptions are wrong." She looked back at Cass. "The operational schedules you gave him, how specific?" "General. Meeting windows, arrival and departure times, communication protocols. Nothing tactical." "The summit," she said. "Does he know I know about it?" Cass shook his head. "I found out 2 hours before you did. I haven't transmitted anything since your communications hold." She looked at the audio device on the table. Damon said, "The device was insurance. He put it in place assuming you'd hold a meeting in that room because it's the obvious room for that conversation. He didn't need Cass to tell him. He just needed to hear what happened." "Which means he now has everything I showed you," she said. "Yes." Damon's voice was level. "He knows the full picture you have, the routing map, the men connection, the timeline. He knows we're working together. He knows that now." She stood up. She walked to the window and looked out at the cliff face and the ocean below it, which was violent now under the storm. white at the edges, gray-green further out. She put her hands in her coat pockets and felt the small envelope from her grandfather's drawer, which she'd been carrying since that morning. Finish it. He'd known, she thought. Maybe not the specifics, maybe not Cass, maybe not the exact shape of the device in the library window, but he'd known the thing she was walking into was larger than what she could see from where she was standing, and he'd sent her in anyway because there was no one else, and the alternative was doing nothing, and Silas Veyne had never in his life chosen to do nothing. She turned around. Cass, she said. He looked at her. I need everything Vale thinks he knows about the summit presentation. Everything you gave him that he's built his plan around. Every assumption he's made based on your intelligence over 3 years. I need to know where his picture of this is wrong. He nodded slowly. That'll take time to reconstruct. You have 2 hours. She looked at Damon. And I need you on the phone with Holt tonight regardless of the hour. The accountant. Men's accountant. We need that meeting moved up. Tomorrow morning, if possible. I'll make it happen. We also need to think about the archive. She looked between the two of them. Lucien is going to try to access it before the summit. He can't use Cass now. Cass is burned on that channel whether or not Lucien knows it yet, so he'll try another way. Marsh, Damon said. Marsh is on the property, Cass said. He's been here since the funeral. And he has family access, she said. Not archive credentials. Those require a state director authorization, but he knows the physical layout. He knows where the servers are. She looked at Cass. Who else in this building has physical knowledge of the archive location? 7 people, Cass said, including your father. My father is not going to help Marsh. No, but he might not stop him either, if he believes stopping Marsh means consolidating your position. She took that in, weighed it. She went to the door and opened it and spoke to Rourke, who was positioned at the corridor junction outside. I need Marshal Veyne's location confirmed right now, and I need 2 of your people on him. Luce, I don't want him to know, but I need to know where he goes. Rourke was on his radio within seconds. She came back into the room. Damon was looking at her with that expression she'd seen start to form across the table in the library. The one that wasn't trust yet, but was something her. You're running this whole building, he said. Trying to, she said. There's a difference between trying and... His phone buzzed. He looked at it. His expression changed. What? She said. He turned the phone so she could see the screen. It was a text from an unsaved number. Routed. She could tell from the format, through the same relay system she'd used to contact him that morning. 3 sentences. The summit has been moved. Tomorrow night. You've been formally summoned by name. Both of you. She read it twice. Not 4 days. Tomorrow. Lucien had heard the conversation in the library. He'd heard the 72-hour window. He'd heard the plan to approach Men's accountant, to build the case, to walk into the summit with complete evidence. And he'd pulled the timeline in by 3 days. She said, he's cutting off our preparation window. He heard everything, Damon said. He knows exactly how much time we needed, and he's taken it. She looked at the message again. Formally summoned by name. Both of you. Not just Damon. Not just the Veyne family. Both of them by name, together, which meant Lucien was going to frame their alliance as the threat, walk into that summit, and present their coordination as evidence of exactly the kind of cross-family conspiracy he'd spent 6 years manufacturing the appearance of. They would walk in looking guilty. The family heads would see 2 people who'd been working together in secret, with financial documents that could be read in multiple directions, and Lucien would stand at the front of the room with Men's authority already activated and the archive access already arranged through Marsh, and by the time anyone asked the right questions, it would already be finished. Unless. She looked at Cass. He was watching her the way he had when she was young, not with the sentimentality of an old man watching a child he'd known grow up, but with the specific attention of someone who had always understood she was going to be the most dangerous person in any room she chose to enter. He'd betrayed that for 3 years, and she did not have time right now to decide what to do with that fact, and so she set it down in a corner of herself where it would wait until she could afford to pick it up. The archive, she said. Everything Silas was tracking on Lucien. All of it. It's there, Cass said. Can you get it out before Marsh gets to it? If I move in the next 30 minutes. Then move, she said. All of it. Physical copies and digital. Bring it to this room. Touch nothing else. He was out of the chair and through the door before she finished the sentence. She turned to Damon. He was already dialing Holt. She listened to him talk. Short, direct, the specific vocabulary of a man who had spent years communicating sensitive things in rooms where the walls might be listening, except now he was operating without the infrastructure he'd trusted. And she could hear him adjust in real time, choosing words that carried meaning without carrying traceable specificity. He was good at it. She'd always known he was smart, had spent 4 years knowing it from across a dinner table while acting as though she didn't, and there was something deeply uncomfortable about standing next to it directly, unmediated by performance. The call ended. "Holt can get someone to the accountant tonight," Damon said. "Not tomorrow morning, tonight, within 4 hours. Will it hold under pressure? Holt's people know how to apply pressure in both directions." "I need documentation," she said. "Not just a verbal, something men can't disavow in a room full of witnesses." "Understood." She pulled out a legal pad from the desk in the corner and began writing. Not the organized columns from this morning. This was faster, rougher, a working map of what they had and what they were going to walk into that room with tomorrow night and what they needed the sequence to be. She wrote for 6 minutes straight without speaking. Damon stood behind her left shoulder and read as she wrote and didn't interrupt, which was more useful than anything else he could have done. When she stopped, he said, "The presentation sequence is right, but we're still walking in there with evidence that he's heard." "Yes." "He'll have counter-prepared." "Yes." "So the evidence isn't enough on its own?" She put the pen down. "No," she said. "It's not." She looked at what she'd written. Then she looked at the window, at the storm outside, at the cliff edge just visible through the gray. "We need something he doesn't know we have," she said. "Something that wasn't in that room when he was listening." Damon said, "What do we have that wasn't in that room?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she looked at him and said, "You." He blinked. "Everything I showed you in that library," she said. He heard me explain. He knows the routing map. He knows the men connection. He knows the seizure mechanism. What he doesn't know, what has never been in any room he was listening to, is what you found on your own. Before you came here, the decommissioned server, the recovered correspondence. Damon's expression changed slightly. "He left that for me to find," Damon said slowly. "He planted that thread." "He planted it to point you toward me," she said. "He didn't expect you to come here. He expected you to come after me, to contact lawyers, to go to war with the Veyne organization, to give him the open conflict he needed. Instead, you came here and brought it with you." She held his eyes. "He doesn't know what you have. He doesn't know you've seen the full picture. In his model, you and I are still adversaries who happen to be operating in proximity. He thinks I'm here because I want leverage over you. He thinks you're here because you're Damon Calderon, and Damon Calderon doesn't cooperate with anyone unless he's getting something out of it." The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, something drier and more self-aware. "He's not entirely wrong about that," he said. "No," she said. "He's not." A knock at the door. Rourke opened it. "Mr. Veyne is moving," he said. "Marshall. He left his room 10 minutes ago and he's heading toward the lower east corridor, toward the archive." She looked at Damon. He was already moving for the door. She was right beside him, and together they went down the corridor at a pace that was not quite running, but was everything that running was, except the sound of it. And the storm outside beat against the stone walls of the estate, and the lights in the lower corridors flickered once under a power surge and then held, and somewhere below them Marshall Veyne was walking toward a room full of his brother's secrets, with 31 years of someone else's betrayal opening the door for him. And on the other side of the city, in a hotel room on the 43rd floor, Lucian Vale was standing at his window, looking at the storm and holding his phone, and waiting for confirmation that the archive had been accessed, which would tell him the last piece was in motion, which would tell him that by tomorrow night everything he had built for 6 years would finally close. His phone showed no new messages. He looked at it. Still nothing. He set it face down on the dresser and poured himself a glass of water and drank it, and looked at his own reflection in the dark glass of the window, and told himself the silence was normal, told himself the timeline was intact, told himself that the woman he'd placed inside that house 4 years ago was exactly where he'd calculated she'd be. He told himself that, and the storm outside said nothing back. They found Marshall Veyne in the archive corridor with his hand on the door. Not inside, not yet. He'd gotten as far as the keypad on the exterior wall and was standing in front of it with a piece of paper in his hand. Numbers written in someone else's handwriting, credentials. Cass had clearly passed to him at some point before the communications hold went into effect. The door was still closed. The keypad was still red. Cass had changed the access code before he'd gone in to retrieve the files. Marshall heard them coming and turned around, and the expression on his face went through 5 things in 2 seconds. Surprise, then the performance of innocence, then the recognition that the performance wasn't going to work, then a brief and almost comical attempt at dignity, and finally something that collapsed into its own weight and became simply what it was. The face of a man who had been caught doing the thing he'd been doing for 6 years and had run out of room to maneuver. He was 64 years old, heavier than his brother Roland, with the particular softness of a man who had spent decades in proximity to power without ever being required to use his body to defend anything. He had always had a slightly aggrieved quality about him, as though the world owed him a better position than the one it had assigned. Elara had known him her whole life, and had never been able to fully articulate why she'd never trusted him. And standing in the archive corridor looking at him now, she understood it was because the aggrievement had always been just below the surface, contained but legible to anyone who knew to look. She had always known to look. "Elara," he said. He didn't look at Damon. "Step away from the door," she said. He stepped away. He made no move to conceal it or discard it, which told her he'd already calculated that concealment was pointless and was trying to decide what the next position was. "The code's wrong," he said, with a slight gesture toward the keypad, almost conversational, as though he'd simply been trying to access a filing system and found the password had been changed. "I know," she said. "I just needed to—" "Stop," she said. Not loudly. The word just landed and sat there. He stopped. She looked at him for a long moment. She was aware of Damon beside her and Rourke behind them both, and the weight of the estate above and around them. All that stone, all that history, all those years of something her family had built at enormous cost that this man had been quietly, methodically helping someone else take apart. "How much did he pay you?" she said. Marshall's jaw moved. "It wasn't— I'm not asking whether it was about money. I'm asking how much." A pause. "Over 6 years. 11 million through a trust in my name in Zurich." Damon made a sound that wasn't quite a word. "And what did you give him?" she said. "I gave him what he asked for. Organizational schedules, communication protocols, the internal hierarchy." Marshall's voice had taken on a flat, recitative quality, the voice of a man giving testimony he'd already rehearsed in his own head many times. Meeting records, the foreign partnership agreements from 2019, the insurance provisions for the Atlantic properties. "Did you give him access to Silas's personal research?" "No." His eyes met hers directly for the first time. "That I didn't give him. I want you to know that." "Why not?" "Because your grandfather—" He stopped. Something crossed his face that was too complicated and too private to fully decode. "He knew about me, Elara. At the end. He didn't say anything directly, but I could see it. I could see him looking at me the way he looked at things he'd made a decision about." His hands dropped to his sides, paper still in one of them. "I couldn't give him that." She held his eyes. She didn't tell him whether she believed it. She didn't know yet whether she believed it. "Give Rourke the paper," she said. He handed it over. "You're going to go upstairs and you're going to stay in your room until I tell you otherwise. You're not going to contact anyone. You're not going to attempt to access any system in this building." She paused. "And tomorrow night you're going to come with us." He blinked. "To the summit?" "Yes." He stared at her. "That's not optional," she said. Rourke took Marshall Veyne upstairs. She and Damon stood in the corridor and she let out a breath that had been sitting in her chest for longer than she'd realized. The archive door was still closed. Cass had gotten the materials out before Marshall had gotten close, which meant the most critical piece of Lucian's plan, the institutional documentation that would have made the seizure legally airtight, was sitting in 3 boxes in the East Study rather than in transit to a hotel room on the 43rd floor. He's going to know by morning that Marsh failed, Damon said. Yes. He'll adjust. He'll try to, she said. She turned away from the door. Let's go see what Cass pulled. They worked through the night. That was the only honest way to describe what the next 7 hours were. Not strategic planning in any clean sense. Not the kind of operation that got reconstructed afterward with clear phases and decision points. But 7 hours of sustained grinding work in a room that smelled of old paper and lamp oil, with 3 boxes of Silas Veyne's personal research spread across every flat surface, and Cass moving through it with the institutional knowledge of 3 decades, and Damon on the phone every 40 minutes with Holt and Elara writing and rewriting the sequence of what they would present, and how they would present it, and in what order. Because order was everything in a room full of people who were already predisposed to believe what they'd been told to believe. At 2 in the morning, Holt's contact met with Men's private accountant in a restaurant in the financial district that closed at midnight and reopened briefly for one table. At 3:45, documentation arrived through a channel Damon had established through Holt. Not a scan, not a photo, but a notarized transfer record showing the holding structure connected to Men's personal financial entity, signed by the accountant who had prepared it, with a cover letter that described the nature of the arrangement in language that was careful enough to be deniable in isolation and damning enough to be unambiguous in context. Elara held the document under the lamp and read it twice. "This is it," she said. Damon was looking over her shoulder. He smelled of cold air and black coffee and the particular exhaustion that comes from a night spent making calls you can't afford to make badly. "It's enough to present," he said. "Whether it's enough to hold, it'll hold," she said. "In that room, with everything else, it'll hold." He was quiet for a moment. "You're certain about the sequence?" "I'm certain about the first 2/3, she said honestly. "The last piece depends on Lucian doing what I think he'll do when he realizes we have more than he expected. And if he doesn't," she set the document down, "then we improvise." He almost smiled at that. It was a tired expression, off-center, nothing like the controlled presentation she'd watched him maintain across 4 years of dinners and organizational functions. It was the face of a man who had been awake all night working on a problem he hadn't chosen and had arrived at something that was possibly close to respect. She looked away before it could become a conversation. At 5 in the morning, she went to the window and watched the storm finish. The rain had stopped somewhere around 4, but the sky was still moving, still unsettled, the gray of it going lighter in the east in a way that was less like dawn and more like the world simply reasserting that time was passing, whether anyone was ready for it or not. She thought about her grandfather, not the note, not the instructions, just him. The particular weight of his presence in a room, the way he always let silence do the work that other men rushed to fill with words. She had learned more from watching him be quiet than from anything he'd ever directly taught her. She had learned that patience was not passivity, that stillness was not absence, that the most dangerous thing a person could do was make their opponents believe they were less than they were. She had done that for 4 years inside a house where a man had told her she was useless, and she had let him believe it because believing it made him careless, and his carelessness had given her everything she needed to walk into a room tomorrow night and end something that had been running for 6 years in the dark. She hoped he knew. Wherever he was, she hoped Silas Veyne knew. She turned away from the window. There was work left to do. The summit was held in a private facility 40 minutes outside the city, a converted manor house that the major families used for meetings that required neutral ground and absolute discretion. No recording devices permitted, no staff inside the meeting room, a single security presence outside each door, drawn from a rotating pool that no individual family controlled. Elara had been to this building once before, when she was 17 and her grandfather had brought her to observe a boundary negotiation between the Veyne organization and 2 smaller regional outfits. She'd sat in an anteroom and watched through a gap in the door and Silas had never acknowledged she was there, which she'd understood at the time as his way of teaching her. You don't announce your presence until you're ready to use it. She walked through the front door of that building now. Damon was beside her. Not behind her, not ahead, beside. And she had not asked him to position himself that way, and he hadn't announced it. He'd simply done it, and she registered it without comment. The entry hall was already occupied. 7 men in various states of preparedness, some seated, some standing, some with phones they were putting away as she and Damon entered. Faces she recognized from her grandfather's files, from organizational maps, from the specific memory of a woman who had spent years training herself to hold names and faces and relationships in the architecture of her attention without letting any of them see they'd been stored. They registered her and Damon with the particular controlled quality of men who had been told what to expect and were recalibrating to the reality of it. Lucian Vale was standing at the far end of the hall. He was dressed the way he always dressed, quietly, with the precision of someone who understood that restraint in presentation was itself a form of power. Silver hair, dark coat, the unhurried posture of a man who believed he was standing in the wreckage he'd arranged. He looked at Elara when she entered, and his expression did not change, which was itself information. A man who was genuinely confident would have allowed himself a small reaction to the thing he hadn't expected. Lucian gave her nothing, which meant he was working. She gave him nothing back. They filed into the meeting room. The room was long, with a central table and chairs arranged without hierarchy. No head position, no obvious authority placement. That was traditional for these gatherings. Every family at the table, every voice nominally equal, the fiction of parity maintained so that the actual power could operate beneath it without the friction of formal precedence. Lucian took a position at the center of one long side. Elara sat directly across from him. Damon sat to her right. The other men arranged themselves and the doors were closed, and the room became the specific, weighted silence of people who knew that what happened in the next hour would determine something irreversible. Lucian spoke first. I was good at it. She'd known he would be. He had the particular gift of sounding reasonable, not persuasive in any obvious way, not the kind of speaker who pushed, but the kind who simply organized information in a sequence that made his conclusion feel like the only logical one. He laid out the Calderon financial irregularities. He laid out the Veyne internal compromises. He presented both with the careful balance of a man who appeared to be pained by what he was reporting, a man who had tried to hold things together and found it no longer possible. He built it slowly, methodically, and she let him build it. The men around the table were listening with the focused attention of people who had been in rooms like this before and understood that the way you listened was as important as anything you said. She watched their faces. She watched where their attention went. She watched Lucien watch them, measuring his own effect, and she saw the moment, subtle, just a slight settling of his shoulders, when he believed he had the room. He said, "The evidence of coordinated action between the Veyne and Calderon organizations is incomplete," Elara said. The room shifted. Lucien looked at her. "I'd like to finish," he said. "You'll have the opportunity," she said. "I'm clarifying one point." She looked around the table. The evidence of coordinated action between the Veyne and Calderon organizations that Mr. Vale has presented to you was compiled using information obtained through a surveillance operation that Mr. Vale himself established inside both families. What you've been shown is not independent evidence. It is a curated selection of information gathered by the person who is now presenting it to you as objective. A stillness in the room, the specific stillness of people reconsidering the geometry of what they're looking at. Lucian said, "That's the characterization that—" "I have the routing records," Elara said. She placed a folder on the table. Not opened, just placed, the way her grandfather had always placed things, letting the object do its own work. The shell structure Mr. Vale used to position financial instruments within both organizations. His authorization signature is on the foundational documents. I have 17 months of correspondence between Mr. Vale and Marshal Vane detailing the coordination. I have the decommissioned server records from the Calderon organization showing the original architecture. She paused. And I have documentation of an arrangement between Mr. Vale and a regulatory authority official named Carver Men, including the holding structure established to receive a percentage of the absorbed assets following the emergency seizure that Mr. Vale has been working to trigger. The room was completely still. Lucian's expression had not broken. She gave him credit for that. He said steadily, "These are allegations without—" Damon opened his folder. He did it without theater, just opened it and laid 3 documents on the table face up and slid them toward the center where they could be seen. The notarized transfer record, the cover letter from Men's accountant, the server correspondence with Lucian's authorization strings visible in the header data. The accountant who prepared the holding structure signed a statement last night, Damon said. His voice was level, completely controlled, the voice of a man who had spent a lifetime in rooms like this and was entirely comfortable in them. The statement details the arrangement, the timeline, and the agreed percentage. Men's name is in the document header on 6 separate instruments. One of the men at the table, a compact, gray-haired man named Foss, who ran the Northeastern Distribution Network and who Elara knew had been doing business with Lucian's shell structures for 3 years without knowing it, leaned forward and picked up the notarized transfer record and read it. He read it for a long time. Then he set it down and looked at Lucian. Lucian looked back. And in that look, Elara saw the moment the room changed ownership. It didn't happen loudly. There was no outburst, no dramatics. Foss set the document down, and the man to his left picked it up, and the document made its way around the table in the particular silence of people absorbing something that required their full cognitive attention, and with each pair of hands it passed through the temperature of the room. Dropped another degree, and Lucian Vale stood at the center of it, and aged, visibly, in real time. "I'd like to address," he started. "Sit down, Lucian," Foss said. It was 4 words. Foss said them the way you say something to a person who no longer has standing in the room. Not angry, not theatrical, factual. Lucian sat down. Elara reached into the folder she'd brought and placed one more document on the table. This one she slid directly to the man sitting at Lucian's right, a man named Caro, who had served as the closest thing the assembled families had to a structural authority on inter-organizational agreements. "This is a legal instrument my grandfather established 14 months ago," she said, "before his death. It was prepared in anticipation of a specific scenario involving coordinated external seizure of Veyne organizational assets. The instrument establishes an automatic notification provision. Any attempt to invoke emergency seizure authority against the Veyne organization triggers immediate disclosure of this documentation to every relevant regulatory and organizational authority simultaneously." She held Caro's eyes. Mr. Vale knew this provision existed in theory. He didn't know it had been activated. Caro read it. He read the first page and the last page, and then the signature block, and then he looked up at Elara with an expression that was as close to impressed as a man like Caro ever permitted himself. "Silas filed this," he said. 14 months ago, she confirmed. "The activation was my authorization, entered into the instrument's triggering mechanism at 8:47 this morning, which meant that from 8:47 this morning, any move by men, any invocation of the seizure authority, any attempt to use the provision Lucian had spent 3 years positioning him to use would result in an automatic, unstoppable release of everything Elara had compiled to every authority that mattered, not just the assembled families, regulatory bodies, legal oversight, every channel simultaneously. Lucian would not simply lose, he would be the mechanism of his own exposure." Caro set the document down. He looked at Lucien. Lucien was looking at the table. Elara watched him process it. Watched the man who had spent 6 years building a machine designed to absorb 2 organizations in a controlled collapse sit at a table, surrounded by the leaders of those organizations, and understand that the machine had been fitted, at some point he hadn't identified, with a component that inverted its function. He had built a lever. Someone had quietly turned it around. He looked up. He looked at her. And she looked back at him with the same expression she had worn for 4 years across the dinner table, in a house where the man beside her had believed she was nothing, completely level, completely present, giving him exactly as much as she chose to give, and not one particle more. "The name," Lucian said. His voice was still controlled, which she respected even now. "In your organization, the one who helped you build this." He tilted his head slightly. "It wasn't Cass. He didn't know enough." "No," she said. "It wasn't Cass." "Then who?" She held his eyes. "My grandfather." A pause. "He knew about you 4 years ago," she said. "He didn't have enough to move on you then. So he built the instrument, activated the provisions, and sent me in to get the rest." She let that sit for a moment. "He didn't send me in blind. He sent me in with a legal structure already in place that made it impossible for you to win, even if everything else went your way. He just needed me to stay long enough to activate it." Lucian was very still. "He knew," Lucian said. "He was Silas Veyne," she said. "He knew." The room sat with that for a moment. Then Foss said, with the particular finality of a man closing a door, "This meeting is concluded." He looked at Caro. "I'd like to move to a private session, families only." Caro nodded. Lucien Vale was escorted from the room by two men who did not touch him but positioned themselves in a way that made the direction clear. He walked out with his composure intact, which would be the last thing he had, because by morning men would have received formal notification from 4 separate organizational channels, and the holding structure would be frozen, and the 6-year architecture would begin its systematic disassembly under the attention of people whose job was exactly that kind of disassembly. He didn't look back at her. She hadn't expected him to. The private session lasted 2 hours. She sat across from Caro and Foss and 3 other men whose names she'd known for years and whose faces she was meeting directly for the first time, and she negotiated the terms of the Veyne organization's continued operation with the particular clarity of someone who has been preparing for a specific conversation for a very long time and has finally arrived at it. Damon sat beside her for the first 40 minutes. Then Caro raised the issue of the Calderon organization's independent status, and Damon took that portion himself, and she sat beside him and said nothing, and listened to him work and thought that there was something quietly extraordinary about the experience of sitting next to a person whose intelligence you'd spent 4 years pretending you couldn't see and finally being able to acknowledge it without cost. The terms were agreed, both organizations intact, both accountable to a restructured oversight agreement that Caro would administer. Men's provision permanently revoked. Marshal Veyne to face a formal organizational inquiry. Cass Farrell, she had negotiated this separately, before the meeting, alone with Caro by phone, to be removed from operational responsibility, but permitted to retire without formal action, in acknowledgement of the 8 months in which he'd gone quiet and the archive he'd protected. She wasn't sure that was right. She wasn't sure it was wrong either. She thought about the 31 years. She thought about a man who had made a bad calculation and then sat with it for 3 years, and then, when it mattered most, changed one thing, one quiet thing, 8 months of silence, a code changed on a keypad, that had kept the worst of it from happening. People were not clean. She had always known that. She had stopped expecting them to be. It was past noon when they walked out of the building into a pale, washed-out autumn sunlight that felt entirely disproportionate to what the morning had contained. The storm had left everything clean and too bright, the kind of light that makes you squint and feel briefly, irrationally exposed. Damon stopped at the bottom of the steps. She stopped beside him. They stood there for a moment without speaking, which was the first moment in approximately 31 hours that nothing was immediately required of either of them. He said, "What happens now?" She thought about it honestly. "I go home," she said. Run what Silas built. Try to do it the way he would have wanted, which means probably not exactly the way he did it. She paused. And restructure the oversight so that what just happened can't happen from the inside again. That'll take time. Yes. He looked at the sky. The light was moving, clouds still crossing. I have to rebuild from Lucien, he said. Most of my operational structure ran through him at some point. The whole thing needs to be audited. He said it without self-pity, just as information. It'll take a year, maybe 2. I know. He looked at her. You could have told me, he said, earlier, some version of what you were doing. I know, she said again. I couldn't. I know you couldn't. He held her eyes. I'm not saying you were wrong. I'm saying I understand now why you didn't. A pause. And I understand what it cost. She looked back at him. The thing he was describing, that the 4 years, the dinners, the specific quality of performing invisible in a house with a person who had decided to not see you. She had never been going to discuss it with him, had put it in the place where things that couldn't be undone lived, and had planned to leave it there permanently. She didn't answer him directly. What she said was, "You found the device." He blinked. "In the library. You found it and texted me before you'd reached the gate. You could have kept that information, used it." She held his eyes. "You didn't." He was quiet for a moment. "No," he said. "I didn't." "I know," she said. They stood in the thin autumn sunlight and didn't say anything else for a while. And it wasn't comfortable exactly, but it was honest, which was a different thing entirely, and in some ways more valuable. He offered her his hand. She looked at it. She shook it. His grip was firm and brief, and she let go first, and he let her, and they walked to separate cars without looking back. 3 weeks later, on a Thursday afternoon that had turned unexpectedly warm for the season, Elara Veyne sat at a small table outside a restaurant at the edge of a harbor town 2 hours from the city. The restaurant was the kind of place that didn't take reservations, and had paper napkins and a view of working boats rather than pleasure craft. And she had chosen it because it was not the kind of place anyone would expect to find her. She'd been running the Veyne organization for 19 days. It was harder than she'd expected in the specific ways she hadn't anticipated, and easier in the ways she'd prepared for, which was about the most honest assessment she could make. Her father had been difficult for the first week and then had become, cautiously and without fanfare, useful. Her cousins were managing their surprise with varying degrees of grace. The overseas partnerships were watching closely. She was watching back. She had a cup of coffee in front of her, and a legal pad she'd been writing on, and the harbor water in her eyeline, which she found settling in a way she couldn't fully articulate but didn't feel she needed to. A car pulled up across the street. She recognized it. Damon got out, looked around, found her. He crossed the street and came to her table and looked at the empty chair across from her with a question in his expression. She nodded. He sat down. Neither of them said anything for a moment. A server came and he ordered coffee, and the server left, and the harbor moved in the way harbors move, constantly, without urgency, with the particular indifference of things that have been doing what they're doing long before anyone was watching. "How's the audit going?" she said. "Slowly," he said. "Lucien had his hands in more than I knew, which I expected, but the specific places are—" He paused. "Uncomfortable. You'll find it all." "Probably." He looked at his hands on the table. "I hired 3 external forensic accountants. People with no prior Calderon connection." "Good." "Your suggestion," he said. "Yes." He looked up. "You could have let it collapse," he said. "The Calderon organization. After everything, you had enough leverage. The families would have absorbed it." She shook her head. "That's what Vale wanted." "You could have wanted it for different reasons." She looked at him steadily. "I didn't." He held her eyes for a moment. Then he nodded once, and something settled in his expression. Not relief exactly, but the particular quality of a question that had been answered at sufficient depth to stop needing to be asked. His coffee arrived. He wrapped both hands around the cup. "I owe you an apology," he said, "a real one. Not the kind I was prepared to make 3 weeks ago in a parking lot after a meeting." He looked at the table. "The things I said, the way I treated what we—" He stopped, tried again. "The way I dismissed you for 4 years." He looked up. "I was wrong about what you were, about what I was doing." His jaw moved. "I'm sorry." She looked at him for a long time. The harbor moved. A boat was coming in, engine low, cutting a white line through the dark water. 2 men on the deck doing the particular practiced work of bringing a vessel in without ceremony. "I know you are," she said finally. She didn't say it's fine because it wasn't entirely, and she didn't say it doesn't matter because it did, and she didn't say I forgive you because forgiveness wasn't the word for what she was doing with it, which was more like carrying it to a place where it no longer had the same weight as it once had, and leaving it there without needing it to disappear entirely. What she said was, "You called me useless because it was easier than seeing what I was." He didn't flinch from that. "Yes. And I let you," she said, "because I needed you to." He looked at her with the particular expression of someone hearing a truth they already knew from the outside for the first time from the inside. "Does that bother you, now?" She thought about it honestly. "Some days," she said, "less than it used to." He nodded. They sat for a while longer, finishing their coffee, watching the harbor do its slow and indifferent work. They talked a little, practical things, organizational things, the kind of conversation that two people in adjacent positions of responsibility conduct when they've recently been through something large together and aren't yet sure what the language is for the space on the other side of it. He asked, at one point, whether she ever thought about what the marriage might have been. She was quiet for long enough that it was an answer in itself. Then she said, "I think about who I was before I went in, and who I am now. And I know the 4 years made me into something I couldn't have become any other way." She looked at the water. "I don't know how to separate those things out neatly, so I don't." He absorbed that. When they stood to leave, he reached into his inside pocket and held something out to her. She looked at it. Her wedding ring. The one she'd left on his laptop keyboard. She looked at it for a moment. The morning light caught it in a way that was almost too clean, too deliberate. The kind of moment that would have felt scripted if it weren't happening on a Thursday afternoon at a harbor restaurant with paper napkins. She shook her head. "Keep it," she said. "Or don't. That's yours to decide." He closed his hand around it. "Will I see you again?" he said. "We operate in the same world," she said. "Probably." It wasn't a yes, it wasn't a no. It was the honest answer to a question that deserved one, from a woman who had spent 4 years giving dishonest answers and intended to spend the rest of her life giving the other kind. She picked up her legal pad. She put some cash on the table. She left the harbor without looking back, the way she'd left his driveway 3 weeks ago in the rain. Except this time there was no suitcase and no darkness and no performance of smallness required. There was just the road and the light and the particular quality of a morning that belonged entirely to her. She got in her car and drove. Behind her, the harbor continued its work without pause, without ceremony, the water moving the way water moves, not because anyone needs it to, but because that's what it does, and it will keep doing it long after every decision made on its edges has folded into the past and become simply the shape of what happened. She drove north toward the estate, toward the work that was waiting. She did not look back. She did not need to. The woman who had been called useless on a rainy driveway at 2 in the morning was gone, not because she'd been destroyed and rebuilt, but because she had always been something else and had simply, finally, stopped pretending otherwise. The road was empty ahead of her. That was enough. That was everything.